So here we go with our wrap up of chapter three and mini analysis of what's going on in terms of the themes. And I think what I'm most impressed about in chapter three, what really amazes me, is how James is kind of moving back, circling back to chapter one, but then at the same time, he's also progressively moving things forward and taking us into the conclusion of the book, pushing us into James 4, into the next chapter at the same time. Um, I'm you know I'm amazed to be seeing some of these things, and I hope and trust that it's a benefit to you as well. Um, I look at the first several verses, of course, chapters 3, verses 1 through 12, are all about the tongue. And when I look at the various ways, note the word various, um, the number of ways that James refers to the tongue. He says in verse 6, the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting it on fire, setting on fire the entire course of life, and is set on fire by hell itself. Um, I think like this is interesting. He goes on to in verse 8 says it's a restless evil. It's full of deadly poison. That's a lot of things to say about the tongue. And when I hear that and when I read that, um, I'm seeing a very close similarity to the whole question of various kinds of trials. Think about the various ways that your mouth can get you in trouble. Your mouth gets you in trouble by hurting others, by defaming the name of Christ, by putting yourself in precarious situations, discouragement in general. There's a lack of purity in terms of how we're actually moving forward with our words and actions together. There's typically ways in which we're tripping up our own testimony. I'm convinced that that some of the trials that we're facing are not just external. The tongue itself is an internal trial. The tongue itself is presenting problems that requires wisdom, and that's why I think there's a whole revisiting of wisdom in the second half of the chapter. The trial is closer than we think. But even before I go into that next part of the wisdom, look at this language here that we can see. Verse 11 or verse 10 says, "From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs?" Note what's being contrasted here. This is a problem because it's back and forth, right? How can it be both blessing and cursing? How can it be both fresh and salt water from the same opening? Um, that sounds like instability to me. Sounds like instability, and you know, James is saying if you're seeking wisdom, you have to have faith. But if you're seeking to tame the tongue, one way in which you need to stabilize the tongue is by seeking wisdom to tame it so that you're stable in your speech. There's a stability in speech that's needed, right? Because he's in he's in back in chapter 1, he's telling us that the person who doubts is like a wave of the sea, tossed and driven by the winds. right? That person is unstable. He's double-minded, unstable in all of his ways, and our mouths show forth the instability of our hearts, and so the lack of purity. And remember, the word pure really means unmixed. You know, if something is 100% pure, there's nothing else in it but that thing, right? And so to be unstable in mouth is is requiring a wisdom to tame it. Um, the instability in our words show an instability in our hearts, and we need wisdom from God. So I don't want to go into the whole teaching on wisdom again, which we did just yesterday, but um, again, this is the wisdom that we need, right? A multifaceted wisdom, a wisdom that addresses the full circle of problems that we can face, because you need multifaceted wisdom for multifaceted problems, and our mouths produce that. Now he says, you know, show me your wisdom, right? By his conduct, let him show um, his works in the meekness of wisdom. And so this is going back again to chapter 2 with the whole question of whether or not you have faith and I have works. You know, there's no such a thing. I need faith and works. You have to be able to demonstrate your faith by your works. Don't just tell me you're wise because you have these great words of wisdom and you have all these pearls of knowledge, but you should be able to demonstrate and to prove that the wisdom you have is more than just superficially good sounding talk, right? But there's real power behind your words, and that comes through with respect to your deeds. Now, the language that he uses here, I think, is interesting as well. Verse 17 and 18, he says, but wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial, right? Throwback to chapter 2 again, the whole question of favoritism and impartiality there. Um, Full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. A harvest, and the harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. You know, the language here again is agricultural, it's harvest talk, and we've seen this before. We've seen this again back in chapter 1. In chapter 1, um, we're told in verse 18 that of his own will, of the Father's own will, going back to 17, of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits, right? Of first fruits of his creatures. And so we said back then that first fruits are not the full harvest, right? But it's the evidence that harvest is coming because there's something that's come up out of the ground. And now we're talking about harvest time again. And I just love how these pictures keep coming back. These same themes are being intertwined, but then pushing forward at the same time, because what we can see is that um, you know, chapter 4 begins with what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you. But see how he just talked about peace, right? And and really, so we would assume that 3 would lead into 4, right? But what's often missed in a lot of our studies and paying attention to the text is how you know, chapter by chapter, very often letters are weaving and reweaving, if that's even a word. You know, they're saying what they're saying, and they're saying it again in slightly different terms, slightly different ways, but pushing the teaching forward. You know, it's interesting. In chapter 1, we're hearing be slow to speak, right? verse 19 of chapter 1 says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, every person, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God," right? But then we're told that there is a harvest of righteousness, that if it's sown in peace, produces peace. So then, how does that relate? Because we just talked about how we talk, but James 1 already told us be slow to speak. Slow to speak is taking us on the road. Slow to speak, slow to anger, and quick to listen is a pathway to peace. And that kind of peace is going to produce or be evidence of the righteousness of God. Um, I love how he's continuously weaving, continuously blending everything together. And in chapter 4, we're going to have a whole discussion on fighting and quarrels and evil desires, which again we've seen in chapter 1, right? But but I'm grateful for these moments to kind of think through how uh, the truth of Scripture enforces and reinforces itself. We can see it. We can see the consistency in it, and there's a lot of life going on underneath the surface if we're willing to look. All right. So I'm grateful for your time and attention. We will begin chapter 4 later this week and move forward from there. All right. Um,